Arwen learned the hard way that familial loyalty is a myth. Family ties are just stubborn stains that refuse to scrub out of the carpet. The lesson arrived the night her mother packed her bags, leveled a trembling manicured finger at her, and signed her life over to a man who smelled of cold rain and ozone. $50,000. That was her exact market value. She braced herself for a monster. She prepared for a cage. But the man who bought her didn't lock her away. Instead, he pulled out a chair. Rain stripped the paint off the fire escape outside their apartment window, the relentless rhythm drumming against the thin glass. Arwen stood in the doorway, her wet boots leaking muddy water onto the peeling linoleum of the kitchenette. She was tired. Not the kind of tired a good night's sleep fixes, but a marrow-deep exhaustion that made her bones feel like lead pipes. She had just finished a 9-hour shift scrubbing grease off fryers at a diner that smelled perpetually of burnt onions and despair. All she wanted was a hot shower and the leftover half of a stale bagel. Instead, she got Victor. He sat in the armchair her mother usually reserved for her post-binge hangovers. The chair was a hideous floral pattern, sagging in the middle, but he managed to make it look like a throne built of concrete. He wore a dark, heavy overcoat that was still damp at the shoulders. His presence sucked the air out of the room. It wasn't that he was doing anything menacing. He was just sitting there, large and impossibly still, a predator resting in the tall grass. Her mother Lorraine was frantically zipping a cheap imitation leather suitcase on the dining table. Her hands shook. They always shook, but usually a hit of something powdery or a stiff drink stopped the tremors. Tonight she was practically vibrating. "Ma," Arwen said. Her voice sounded flat, scratchy. "What is this?" She didn't look at her daughter. She shoved a tangled clump of chargers and half-empty makeup bottles into the side pocket. "I'm going away, Arwen, for a bit. Just a little vacation. You know my friend down in Boca, she said I could stay." The smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap vanilla body spray hung heavy in the room, warring with the sharp metallic tang of rain wafting off the stranger in the chair. Arwen shifted her gaze to him. He was older than her, maybe mid-30s, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved with a blunt chisel. His eyes were the color of wet asphalt, dark and indifferent. "Who is he?" Arwen asked, not really wanting the answer. Lorraine finally stopped zipping the bag. She looked at the wall just to the left of Arwen's head. "That's Mr. Costa. We had a business arrangement. Things went a little south, but it's fine now. We worked it out." "Worked it out." Arwen repeated the words slowly, tasting the lie. She looked at the man. "Costa. She owes you money." 50,000. Costa said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of tires on gravel. It vibrated in her chest. "Give or take the interest." "I don't have $50,000, Arwen said, leaning against the doorframe because her knees suddenly felt entirely useless. "I make $11 an hour." "I know," Costa replied. He didn't sound angry. He sounded bored. He uncrossed his legs, the expensive wool of his trousers catching the dim, flickering light of the overhead bulb. "Your mother and I have reached an alternative settlement." The silence that followed was suffocating. The refrigerator hummed its dying, rattling tune. A police siren wailed 3 blocks over. Arwen looked at her mother. Lorraine finally met her eyes, and what Arwen saw there made her stomach drop into a bottomless gorge. It wasn't just guilt, it was relief. "You didn't." The words scraped out of Arwen's throat. "Arwen, it's just for a while." Lorraine's voice pitched up thin and reedy. "Just until I can get the money together, he promised he wouldn't hurt you. You just have to go with him. Do what he says. It's better than them breaking my legs, Arwen. You know what these people do." Arwen stared at her, the woman who taught her how to tie her shoes, the woman who used to braid her hair before the drinking took over. She had sold her, traded her like a poker chip to clear a debt. She waited for the hysteria to hit. She waited to scream, to throw the heavy ceramic mug resting on the counter at her mother's head, to sprint out the door and down the fire escape. But the panic never came. Just a cold, spreading numbness. A cynical voice in the back of her head whispered, "Of course she did." What did she expect? "Pack a bag," Costa said. It wasn't a request. Arwen didn't argue. She didn't cry. She walked past her mother, ignoring her reaching, trembling hand, and went into her tiny, windowless bedroom. She grabbed a duffel bag from under the bed. The zipper caught halfway, just like it always did. She packed pragmatically, mechanically. Underwear, socks, thick sweaters, a toothbrush, her battered copy of East of Eden. She didn't pack anything pretty. She didn't own anything pretty anyway. When she walked back out, Lorraine was gone. The front door was slightly ajar. Costa stood up. He towered over her, a solid wall of muscle and expensive fabric. Up close, Arwen could see a thin white scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked down at her duffel bag, then at her face. He was searching for tears. He didn't find any. "Let's go," he said, turning towards the door. She followed him. She locked the apartment door behind her, a habit too ingrained to break, even though she knew she was never coming back. The car was a black SUV, heavy and armored. The doors closed with a solid, definitive thud that sounded entirely too much like a vault ceiling shut. Arwen sat in the passenger seat, clutching her duffel bag in her lap like a shield. The drive was agonizingly silent. The windshield wipers beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm, thwack-squeak, thwack-squeak. The dashboard glowed with a faint blue light illuminating Costa's hands on the steering wheel. He had large hands. A silver watch peeked out from the cuff of his shirt. Arwen watched his fingers, trying to map out the violence they were capable of. He was Mafia. A loan shark, a leg breaker, a killer. The labels floated in her head, abstract and terrifying. But sitting next to him, smelling the faint, clean scent of cedar and mint coming off him, the cognitive dissonance was making her nauseous. Monsters were supposed to snarl. They were supposed to smell like blood. They weren't supposed to stop at a yellow light and use their turn signals. They left the decaying neon-lit grid of the city and wound their way up into the hills. The streetlights grew scarce, replaced by the dense, imposing shadows of old oak trees. The road slicked with rain tires hissing against the wet asphalt. Eventually, they pulled up to a massive wrought-iron gate. Costa punched a code into a keypad without rolling down his window, and the gates swung inward with a low mechanical groan. They drove up a sweeping driveway to a house that looked less like a home and more like a modern fortress. It was all sharp angles, dark glass, and poured concrete. Minimalist. Cold. Costa killed the engine. The silence rushed back in, ringing in Arwen's ears. "Leave the bag," he said, opening his door. She scrambled out, ignoring him, slinging the duffel over her shoulder. If she was going into a cell, she wanted her own toothpaste. The night air was freezing, biting through her thin jacket. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her pass. She hesitated, her boots hovering over the pristine threshold. Stepping inside meant accepting it. It meant crossing the line from Arwen the diner waitress to Arwen collateral. She stepped inside. The foyer was cavernous. Polished slate floors that echoed with every shift of her weight. No family photos, no art, no warmth, just shadows and the low, barely perceptible hum of a high-end HVAC system. Costa took off his coat and hung it on a sleek metal rack. Underneath, he wore a tailored black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. Arwen caught a glimpse of dark ink creeping up his left wrist before he turned away. "Kitchen is down that hall," he said, his voice flat, pointing a large finger. Guest rooms are upstairs, first door on the right. You have your own bathroom?" Arwen stared at his back as he walked toward a heavy oak door that looked like an office. Her brain struggled to process the instructions. Guest room, not a basement, not a dungeon with a heavy padlock. "Wait," she blurted out. He stopped, turning his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. "What is this?" Her voice shook, finally betraying the terror she had been swallowing for the last hour. "What do you want me to do? I don't know the rules here." Costa turned around fully. He looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since her mother's apartment. His gaze was heavy, sweeping over her damp hair, her cheap jacket, her white knuckles gripping the strap of her bag. There was no lust in his eyes. There was no cruelty. If anything, he looked incredibly weary. "The rules are simple," he said, his tone devoid of inflection. "Don't break anything. Don't let strangers in. The Wi-Fi password is on the router in the living room. But my mother." Arwen swallowed hard, the taste of bile in the back of her throat. "She sold me to you. You bought me." A muscle feathered in his jaw. "Your mother is a liability. She owed money to people far worse than me. I bought her debt so they wouldn't skin her alive and leave her on a sidewalk. You are here because if I left you there, they would have taken you to get to her." He held her gaze for a long, agonizing second. "Go to sleep, Arwen. Lock the door if it makes you feel better. No one is coming in." He turned and walked into his office, shutting the door behind him. The click of the latch echoed through the massive, empty house. Arwen stood in the foyer for a long time, listening to the rain hit the glass. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sudden, terrifying absence of it. She walked upstairs. The carpet was impossibly plush, swallowing the sound of her footsteps. The room he directed her to was huge. A king-sized bed with crisp white linens, a massive window overlooking the dark, rain-swept valley. She walked over to the door and locked it. The heavy brass lock clicked into place. She slid down the door until she hit the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She buried her face in her arms, breathing in the scent of diner grease still clinging to her uniform, and waited for the other shoe to drop. She woke up with a kink in her neck and the taste of old pennies in her mouth. She was still on the floor, her back against the locked bedroom door. The room was bathed in the pale grey light of a rainy morning. Arwen groaned, pushing herself up. Every joint popped in protest. She looked around the room. It hadn't been a nightmare. The sleek, modern furniture, the expensive duvet she hadn't touched, the terrifying silence, it was all real. She walked into the adjoining bathroom. It was larger than her entire apartment kitchen, covered in flawless white marble. She turned on the faucet and splashed freezing water onto her face. In the mirror, she looked like a ghost. Pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, hair a tangled rat's nest. She took off her uniform, the smell of stale fryer oil, suddenly unbearable, and stepped into the glass shower enclosure. The water pressure was a revelation. It pounded against her shoulders, scalding hot, washing away the grease and the grime, but it couldn't wash away the heavy, sinking reality in her gut. She was a hostage. A well-cared-for hostage, perhaps, but a prisoner nonetheless. She dressed in her own clothes, faded jeans and an oversized grey wool sweater that had a hole near the left cuff. She didn't brush her hair. She didn't care. She unlocked the bedroom door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was quiet, but the air felt different, thicker. The subtle scent of dark roast coffee drifted up the stairs. She followed it. Her socks slid silently against the polished wood of the stairs. She rounded the corner into the kitchen. It was an intimidating space, stainless steel appliances, a massive black granite island, and a wall of glass looking out into a walled garden. Costa was there. He was standing by the stove, his back to her. He wasn't wearing the suit jacket or the tie today. Just dark jeans and a plain black fitted t-shirt that stretched across the broad expanse of his back. He was cooking. The crack of an eggshell against a porcelain bowl sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Arwen froze her hand, hovering over the doorframe. She watched as he whisked the eggs, his movements precise and efficient. He didn't look like a mob boss right now. He looked domestic. It scrambled her brain. It made her angry. "I can hear you breathing," he said. He didn't turn around. Her breath hitched. She dropped her hand from the doorframe and stepped fully into the kitchen, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. "I didn't know if I was allowed to wander," she said, her voice coming out raspy. Costa poured the eggs into a hot skillet. The sizzle filled the room, masking the frantic thumping of her heart. "It's a house, Arwen, not a penitentiary. Coffee is in the pot. Mugs are in the cabinet to your left." She stared at his back. "I don't want coffee." "Suit yourself." He took a spatula and expertly folded the eggs. He reached for a plate, slid the omelette onto it, and then turned around. He walked over to the granite island and set the plate down on the side closest to her. Next to it he placed a silver fork. "Eat," he commanded quietly. Arwen looked at the food. It was perfect. Fluffy, steaming smelling of butter and sharp cheddar cheese. Her stomach, which had been twisted into tight, anxious knots for the past 14 hours, betrayed her with a loud, aggressive rumble. Costa's expression didn't change, but she saw a brief, imperceptible softening at the corners of his eyes. He turned his back on her again, pouring himself a mug of black coffee. She walked over to the island. She didn't sit on the bar stool. She stood picking up the fork. She took a bite. It was the best thing she had tasted in months. She hated him for it. She hated that she was eating food provided by the man who owned her mother's debt. She ate half of it, standing up, shoving it into her mouth like a feral dog, expecting him to snatch the plate away at any second. He didn't. He leaned against the counter opposite her, sipping his coffee, watching her with that heavy, unreadable gaze. She dropped the fork onto the plate with a clatter. "Why are you doing this?" "Cooking," he asked dryly. "Because I was hungry." "Stop it!" Her voice cracked. The anger was rising now, hot and sharp, burning away the numbness. "Stop acting like this is normal. Stop acting like I'm a house guest. My mother owed you 50 grand. You run a syndicate, you break bones, you ruin lives. So what is this? Are you fattening me up to sell me to someone else? Are you waiting for me to let my guard down before you put me to work?" Costa set his coffee mug down on the counter. The ceramic clinked sharply against the granite. The easy domestic atmosphere vanished instantly. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. He pushed off the counter and took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward her. She forced herself not to shrink back. She dug her fingernails into her palms, feeling the sting of the crescent moons biting into her flesh. He stopped just on the other side of the island. He was so close she could see the varying shades of grey and black in his eyes. They were exhausted eyes, old eyes in a younger man's face. "If I wanted to sell you," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper, "I wouldn't have brought you to my own home. If I wanted you to work off your mother's debt on your back, you'd be in a club downtown, not standing in my kitchen eating my groceries. Then why?" She demanded, a rogue tear betraying her, slipping down her cheek. She hated it. She swiped it away furiously with the back of her hand. "People like you don't do favors. People like you don't do charity." Costa stared at her. He looked at the spot where she had furiously wiped away her tear. He let out a slow, measured breath, the anger bleeding out of his posture, leaving behind that same weary stillness she had seen the night before. "You're right," he said softly. "I don't do charity. Your mother was a mess. The men holding her paper were going to make an example of her. And then they were going to come to the diner where you scrub floors, and they were going to take you to make up the difference." He leaned forward, bracing his large hands flat on the granite island. "I don't know you, Arwen. But I know what happens to girls like you in this city. I bought the debt because I could. I brought you here because I couldn't guarantee your safety anywhere else. So I'm a stray." She let out a bitter, wet laugh. "You picked up a stray off the street. You're alive." He countered smoothly, unbothered by her venom. "And you're untouched. Whether you view that as a rescue or a kidnapping is entirely up to you. But until the people looking for your mother forget her name, you stay here." He turned away from her, picking up his coffee mug. "Finish your eggs. We have to go into the city this afternoon. I need to get you clothes that don't smell like rancid fryer oil." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with a half-eaten plate of food and a head full of screaming contradictions. She looked at the fork. She looked at the empty doorway. He was a criminal, a monster. But the monster had just made her breakfast and told her she was safe. She picked up the fork. Her hand was shaking again. She took another bite of the eggs, chewing methodically, staring out the window at the relentless driving rain. The cage door was wide open, but out there in the storm, the real wolves were waiting. Here, in the quiet, sterile warmth of the kitchen, there was only him. The inside of the shop smelled of sharp cedar lavender and the crisp, clean scent of newly pressed cotton. There were no racks of clothing to browse, just a sitting area with 2 velvet armchairs, a low mahogany table, and a raised pedestal in front of a 3-way mirror. An older woman emerged from the back. She wore a tape measure draped around her neck like a stethoscope and had pins stuck into a thick cushion strapped to her wrist. Her name was Clara. She didn't ask who Arwen was. She didn't look at Victor with fear or deference, just a brisk professional familiarity. "Stand on the block, dear." Clara directed her voice, carrying a faint, unidentifiable European lilt. Arwen looked at Victor. He had already taken a seat in one of the velvet chairs, pulling a sleek tablet from his coat pocket. He didn't look back at her. He was deliberately removing himself from the process. She stepped onto the pedestal. The wood creaked faintly beneath her weight. Clara descended upon her with swift, impersonal efficiency. The tape measure snapped and pulled cold against her neck, tight across her shoulders, wrapping around her waist. She called out numbers to an unseen assistant in the back room. 32, 24, 35. The numbers felt like an autopsy. They were reducing her to dimensions, cataloguing her for packaging. "She needs basics," Victor said, his eyes never leaving the glowing screen of his tablet. "Sweater's denim a good coat, boots, nothing ostentatious, quality but quiet." Clara hummed in agreement, jotting something down on a notepad. She brought out swatches of fabric, cashmere that felt like spun air, heavy raw denim, thick buttery leather. She draped a charcoal grey coat over Arwen's shoulders. It settled perfectly, the weight of it grounding her. Arwen looked at herself in the 3-way mirror. The girl staring back was a stranger. She didn't look like the waitress who counted quarters to buy bus fare. With her hair pulled back and the elegant cut of the wool framing her sharp collarbones, she looked like someone who belonged in a high-rise. She looked expensive. Arwen hated her. "Take it off," she whispered, her fingers fumbling with the dark horn buttons. Clara paused, her hands hovering mid-air. "Is the fit incorrect? I can take it in at the waist." "No, the fit is fine." She shoved the coat off her shoulders, letting it fall into Clara's waiting arms. She stepped down from the pedestal. Her boots hit the plush rug with a dull thud. "I don't want it. I don't want any of this." Victor finally looked up. He set the tablet face down on the mahogany table. The quiet click of the glass against the wood commanded the entire room's attention. Clara took a discreet step backward, suddenly finding the lint on her sleeve fascinating. "What's the problem, Arwen?" he asked. His tone wasn't angry. It was that same flat, terrifying patience he had displayed in his kitchen. "The problem is that I am not a doll." Her voice shook, but she locked her jaw, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "I am not your pet project. You can buy my mother's debt, you can lock me in your glass house, but you do not get to dress me up like a mob wife in training." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of traffic bleeding through the thick brick walls. Victor stood up. He walked over to her, closing the distance until the scent of his cologne bergamot and something distinctly metallic overpowered the lavender of the shop. He looked down at her, his dark eyes cataloguing the fraying threads on her collar, the scuff marks on her boots, the pale, defiant jut of her chin. "You think this is a game of dress-up?" he asked softly. "I think you're trying to make me forget what I am here for. I am a hostage. You are a target." He corrected his voice, dropping an octave, carrying a sudden brutal edge. "Do you understand how this world works, Arwen? The people who wanted your mother will still be looking for her. If they catch wind of you, they will look at you. If you walk around my property or this city looking like a street kid who hasn't eaten a hot meal in a week, you look like a victim. You look vulnerable." He reached out. She flinched a full-body recoil, anticipating a strike. He didn't hit her. His large, rough fingers brushed against the fabric of her cheap grey sweater, lingering near the collar. The contrast between his dangerous hands and the gentle touch sent a confusing hot spark down her spine. "In my world, vulnerability is blood in the water," he said, his eyes darkening as he watched her throat swallow nervously. "I am not dressing you up to show you off. I am giving you armor. So put the coat back on." He dropped his hand and turned back to his chair. Arwen stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cynical voice in her head, usually so loud, was completely silent. She looked at Clara. The tailor wordlessly held out the charcoal wool. Arwen slipped her arms into the sleeves. It was warm. It was heavy. It felt exactly like armor. The routine settled into her bones faster than she wanted to admit. 5 days passed in the sprawling, silent house on the hill. It was an isolating kind of luxury. The pantry was always fully stocked. The sheets smelled of expensive detergent. The shower never ran out of hot water. Victor was a ghost who occupied the same physical space as her. He left early in the mornings, the rumble of the SUV pulling out of the driveway serving as her alarm clock. He returned late. Sometimes she heard him in his office, his voice a low, commanding murmur on the phone. Sometimes she just found a rinsed espresso cup in the sink the next morning. They existed in a state of armed neutrality. She wore the clothes he bought her. She ate the food. She sat in the sprawling library, working her way through his collection of history books. She waited for the catch. The catch arrived on a Tuesday night. A storm had rolled in off the coast, drowning the house in the sound of drumming rain and the occasional distant crack of thunder. Arwen was in the kitchen boiling water for tea, enjoying the warmth radiating from the stovetop. She had pushed her hair into a messy bun and was wearing one of the thick, oversized cashmere sweaters from Clara's shop. Then the heavy oak front door didn't just open. It slammed against the interior wall with a concussive bang. She froze, the ceramic mug slipping from her fingers. It shattered on the slate floor, hot water splashing against her ankles, but she barely felt it. She backed away from the island, pressing herself against the stainless steel refrigerator, trying to make herself invisible. Footsteps, heavy, wet, and chaotic. "Victor!" a voice bellowed. It was thick with panic and something else, something chemical and frantic. Arwen crept toward the edge of the kitchen doorway, peering down the long, dim hallway that led to the foyer. A man stood dripping on the pristine floor. He was younger than Victor, maybe in his late 20s, wearing a leather jacket that was slick with rain and dark, heavy stains that she instantly knew weren't water. He was holding his right side, pressing a bloody towel against his ribs. His face was pale, his eyes wide and dilated. Victor appeared from his office. He didn't run. He moved with a terrifying predatory grace, stepping into the foyer. He was wearing a dark, button-down shirt, untucked a glass of amber liquid dangling casually from his left hand. Russo, Victor said. His voice was entirely devoid of the weariness she usually heard. It was cold steel. You're bleeding on my floor. They knew about the shipment down at the docks. Russo gasped, leaning heavily against the wall, leaving a smeared crimson handprint on the white paint. O'Malley's guys. They were waiting. They took out Benny. I barely got out of the car. Victor didn't look surprised. He didn't offer comfort. He walked over to Russo, his expression a mask of absolute chilling apathy. I told you to switch the route. Victor said quietly. I thought the old route was clear. It was faster. Russo was shaking now, sliding slowly down the wall. Vic, I need a doctor. It went straight through. You brought O'Malley's attention to my front door, Victor stated. He took a sip of his drink. The clinking of the ice cubes against the glass sounded obscenely loud. Were you followed? No, I lost them. I swear to God, Victor, I circled for an hour. You're sloppy, Russo. Sloppy gets people killed. Sloppy got Benny killed. I'm sorry. Russo whimpered, a grown man crying, sliding until he hit the floor. Please, call Doc. Arwen watched her breath caught tight in her throat, her nails digging into the doorframe. This was it. This was the monster her mother had sold her to. He was standing over a bleeding man drinking scotch, calculating variables, instead of calling an ambulance. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a single number. I need the cleaner at the main house, and tell Doc to meet him here. Bring a mop. He hung up. He looked down at Russo. If you ever bring your mess to my home again, I won't call the doctor. Do you understand? Russo nodded frantically, coughing, a speckle of blood appearing on his lips. Victor turned, his eyes locked directly onto Arwen's. He knew she was there. He had known the whole time. Her heart stalled. She was an intruder in a moment of pure, unadulterated violence. She expected him to yell. She expected him to drag her out and throw her in a room. Instead, his jaw tightened. He set his glass down on the console table, stepped over Russo's legs, and walked straight toward her. She couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the floor. The smell hit her before he reached her rain ozone, and the sharp, coppery stench of fresh blood wafting off the man in the foyer. Victor stepped into the kitchen. He looked down at the shattered mug on the floor, the puddle of hot water. Then he looked at her pale face. Go upstairs. He commanded, his voice low, dropping the terrifyingly calm persona he had used with Russo. Lock your door. Do not come out until I tell you to. He's dying, she whispered, her voice sounding incredibly small. He's not dying. It's a through and through. The doctor will patch him, the cleaner will scrub the floor, and tomorrow it will be like it never happened. Victor reached out, grabbing her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding. His hands were warm. This isn't your world, Arwen. Don't look at it. Go upstairs. She looked into his eyes. There was violence there, yes. But beneath the cold asphalt grey, there was a frantic, urgent need to separate her from the rot of his life. He was pushing her out of the blast zone. She didn't argue. She turned and ran up the stairs. The house was silent again by 2 a.m. The storm had broken, leaving behind a heavy, humid stillness. Arwen sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed in the dark. She hadn't slept. Her mind was a chaotic loop of Russo's bleeding side and Victor's terrifying, calm eyes. This isn't your world. He was wrong. It was her world now. Her mother had made sure of that. She could hide in the guest room all she wanted, but the walls of this fortress were built on blood money. She was eating groceries paid for by whatever happened down at those docks. She couldn't unsee it. She stood up. She unlocked her door. The click echoed in the hallway. The foyer was pristine. No blood, no handprints on the wall. The heavy scent of bleach and lemon cleaner masked the copper tang. The cleaner had done his job. It was a terrifying efficiency. A faint light spilled from the open doorway of the kitchen. She walked toward it, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. She didn't know what she was doing. She should have stayed hidden. Survival instincts dictated that she keep her head down, but the numbness that had protected her since her mother left was cracking, replaced by a morbid, desperate need to understand the man who owned her. Victor was sitting on a bar stool at the kitchen island. The overhead lights were off. The only illumination came from the small lamp on the counter. He had taken off his shirt. It was draped over the back of the stool next to him. Her breath hitched. His back and shoulders were a road map of violence. Scars, some old and faded to white. Others jagged and pink, crisscrossed his skin. A massive, intricate tattoo of a raven with its wings spread covered his left shoulder blade, the ink dark against the pale ruin of his skin. He was holding a piece of white gauze against his right forearm. Blood bright and fresh seeped through the fabric. "I told you to stay upstairs," he said. He didn't turn around. "You told me to stay until you told me to come out," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She stepped fully into the kitchen. "You never told me to come out, and I wanted tea." He let out a short, dry exhale that might have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded so exhausted. He turned slightly on the stool facing her. His face was bruised. A dark purple shadow was blooming along his left cheekbone, and his lip was split. The cool, untouchable mob boss was gone, replaced by a battered man sitting in a dark kitchen. "Russo didn't do that," she noted, nodding at his face. "Russo brought a problem to my door. I had to go clean up the rest of the problem." Victor winced slightly as he peeled the bloody gauze away from his arm. A shallow, angry gash ran from his elbow to his wrist. "A piece of shattered window glass. Occupational hazard." She stood there for a moment. Every instinct screamed at her to make her tea and run back to the safety of her locked room. He was a killer. He was dangerous. But she looked at the awkward angle of his hand, trying to apply pressure and reach for the bottle of rubbing alcohol on the counter at the same time. She thought about the way he had pulled her out of the foyer. "I am giving you armor." She walked forward. Victor stiffened as she approached the island. She didn't look at his eyes. She reached out and took the bottle of rubbing alcohol from his hand. He let her take it, his muscles tense, coiled like a spring ready to snap. "Hold still," she murmured. She uncapped the bottle and grabbed a clean piece of gauze from the first aid kit sitting open on the granite. She poured the alcohol onto the pad. "This is going to burn," she said. "I know," he replied quietly. She pressed the soaked gauze to the long cut on his arm. Victor's jaw locked, the muscles in his arm bunched tight under her fingertips, hard as stone. He didn't make a sound. Up close, the smell of him was overwhelming. Sweat, adrenaline, the lingering smoke of a fired weapon, and the sharp bite of the alcohol. It was a deeply masculine, dangerous scent. She focused entirely on the wound, carefully wiping away the dried blood. Her hands, which used to shake just from handing a customer a hot plate, were perfectly steady. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating in his chest. "Cleaning a cut," she asked, throwing the bloody gauze into a nearby trash can and reaching for a fresh bandage. "You know what I am, Arwen. You saw it tonight. You saw what happens in my world." She unrolled the bandage, wrapping it tightly around his forearm. Her fingers brushed against the hot, taut skin of his wrist. She felt the steady thumping rhythm of his pulse beneath her thumb. "My mother used to bring men home," she said quietly, keeping her eyes fixed on her task. "Men who drank too much. Men who liked to use their fists when they got angry. I learned how to patch split lips and bruised ribs by the time I was 12. She tied off the bandage, smoothing it flat. She finally looked up and met his eyes. They were inches from hers. In the dim light, the grey was swallowed by black. I know what a monster looks like, Victor. She told him, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I know what a man who wants to break things looks like. He stared at her, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before locking back onto her eyes. And what do I look like to you? You look like a man who breaks the monsters. She took a step back, breaking the physical contact. The air between them immediately grew cold. I don't know if that makes you better or worse, but you didn't let that mess touch me tonight. She turned away from him and walked over to the stove. She filled a new mug with water from the tap and set it on the burner. She didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. She could feel his eyes on her heavy and complicated bearing, the weight of a silence that was entirely too loud. They were in the dark, but for the first time since her mother walked out that door, she wasn't stumbling blindly. She saw exactly who she was trapped with. And God help her, the cage was starting to feel a lot less like a prison and a lot more like a sanctuary. Victor descended the stairs a few minutes past 7. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves already rolled up, exposing the edge of the fresh white bandage wrapped around his right forearm. He didn't look at the spot on the floor where Russo had bled. He didn't look at the trash can where she had thrown away the bloody gauze. He walked to the coffee pot, poured a cup black, and turned to face her. "Get dressed," he said. His voice was gravelly, scraped raw by exhaustion. "Jeans, boots, the thickest sweater you have. Are we leaving?" She asked, her fingers tightening around her mug. "No, we're going downstairs." He didn't offer further explanation. He just walked past her, the faint scent of bergamot and masculine soap trailing in his wake. She didn't argue. She went upstairs, pulled on heavy denim and a thick cable-knit sweater, and met him by a door at the end of the hallway she had assumed was a coat closet. It wasn't a closet. It opened to a flight of steep concrete stairs leading into the belly of the house. The air down here was different, cold, stagnant. The hum of the HVAC system was replaced by the low electrical buzz of heavy-duty fluorescent lights. At the bottom of the stairs was a steel door with a biometric scanner. Victor pressed his thumb to the glass. A heavy deadbolt clunked open. He pushed the door wide. It was a shooting range. 2 lanes 50 yards deep, heavily soundproofed with thick acoustic foam lining the walls and ceiling. The air smelled sharply of cordite gun oil and lead. It was an aggressive, unapologetic scent that made the back of her throat itch. At a long steel table to the left, a matte black handgun sat disassembled on a grey mat. "I bought you clothes so you wouldn't look like a victim on the street," Victor said, stepping into the room. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the table and began wiping down a barrel with a small cloth. "But cloth doesn't stop bullets, and keeping you locked in the guest room doesn't stop the O'Malleys from trying to kick my front door down." She stood in the doorway, her stomach twisted. "You want me to shoot a gun? I want you to know how to not die." He corrected his hands, moving with fluid, mechanical precision as he reassembled the weapon. The snick-clack of the slide racking forward echoed sharply in the concrete room. He set the gun down and picked up a magazine, thumbing brass cartridges into it. "Russo was a warning. O'Malley knows I took your mother's debt. He knows you're here. To him you are a pressure point, a way to hurt me. I'm not anything to you." She shot back, her voice echoing off the foam walls. "I'm a transaction." Victor stopped. He placed the loaded magazine on the table and turned around. The bruises on his face were a dark, ugly purple in the harsh, fluorescent light. "If you were just a transaction, Arwen, I would have handed you over to O'Malley last night to make the Russo problem go away," he said softly. He closed the distance between them, his large frame eating up the space, until she had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes. "You aren't collateral anymore. I don't know what you are, but you are mine to protect. And right now, I need you to help me do that." He reached out his hand, wrapping gently around her wrist. He pulled her forward, leading her to the steel table. He picked up the gun. Glock 19, 9mm. It's light reliable, and it doesn't jam if you hold it right. He pressed the cold, knurled grip into her palm. It was heavier than it looked, a dense, lethal weight that made her fingers feel clumsy and fragile. Victor stepped behind her. She stiffened as his chest brushed against her back. He was a furnace of body heat in the freezing room. His left arm reached around her, his large hand covering hers, adjusting her grip. Keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to destroy whatever is in front of you. His voice rumbled right next to her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Thumbs forward. Lock your wrists. He guided her arms up, pointing the barrel down the empty lane. Stance wide. Lean into it. The recoil is going to push back. You have to push forward. She swallowed dryly. The smell of his cologne mixed with the sharp tang of gun oil was intoxicating. She felt the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing against her spine. She was holding a weapon designed solely to tear flesh and shatter bone, and yet surrounded by him, she had never felt safer in her entire life. I can't, she whispered, her hands trembling slightly. You can, he replied, his grip tightening over hers, offering his strength when hers failed. You survived your mother. You survived the streets. You survive everything, Arwen. This is just a louder way of doing it. He stepped back. The sudden absence of his heat left her shivering. Load the magazine, he ordered. She did. Her hands shook the metal, clicking clumsily, but she got it in. She racked the slide just like she had watched him do. The metallic snap was definitive. Final. She raised the gun. She aimed at the paper silhouette 50 yards away. She held her breath, locked her elbows, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening even through the heavy earmuffs he had clamped over her head. The recoil punched backward, jarring her wrists, sending the barrel jerking upward. The smell of sulfur bloomed in the air, thick and acrid. She lowered the gun. She looked at the target. A small hole had appeared in the paper far off to the left shoulder. Again. Victor said. She fired again. And again. The fear burned off, replaced by a cold, methodical focus. With every trigger pull, the terrified diner waitress chipped away, leaving behind something harder, something forged in the dark. She wasn't just his armor. He was teaching her how to be her own. Friday was supposed to be a quiet transition. Victor needed to meet an associate, an old retired enforcer named Sullivan, to negotiate a temporary truce. The O'Malleys were bleeding his supply lines, and Victor needed time to orchestrate a counter-strike. He wouldn't leave her at the house. Not after Rousseau. They drove to a diner on the industrial edge of the city. It was a cruel irony. The air inside smelled exactly like her old life-burnt filter coffee industrial floor wax and the heavy, sweet scent of maple syrup. The vinyl booths were a faded mustard yellow held together by strips of duct tape. Arwen sat in the booth across from Victor and a man with snow-white hair and a face like weathered leather. Sullivan. They spoke in low, clipped tones, using names and terms she didn't know. She stared at her untouched black coffee, watching the oily rainbow sheen on the surface. Under the table, the heavy shape of the Glock 19 rested inside her leather purse. O'Malley is reckless, Victor, Sullivan rasped, tapping a yellowed fingernail against his mug. He's young. He wants to prove he can take the king off the board. He doesn't care about the collateral. He cares about money. Victor replied quietly, his eyes constantly scanning the parking lot through the greasy window. I choke his ports, he starves. He'll back down. Maybe. Sullivan coughed. But cornered dogs don't think about starving. They just bite. The words hung in the air, heavy and prophetic. She saw it before they did. A dark, unmarked panel van didn't pull into a parking spot. It hopped the curb, accelerating across the cracked asphalt, aiming directly for the front of the diner. Victor! She screamed. Her voice was drowned out by the apocalyptic sound of shattering glass and screeching metal. The van smashed through the front window, taking out 2 empty booths and a structural pillar. Brick dust and glass rained down like shrapnel. The world tilted into chaotic, slow motion. Victor lunged across the table, grabbing her jacket and throwing her to the linoleum floor. The booth seat she had just been occupying disintegrated under a hail of automatic gunfire. Dust choked the air, thick and tasting of plaster and copper. People were screaming. The high, terrified shriek of the teenage waitress hiding behind the counter cut through the deafening roar of the guns. "Stay down!" Victor roared over the noise. He had drawn his weapon, a massive, suppressed pistol, from his shoulder holster. He rolled out from behind the shredded booth, firing 3 calculated shots toward the men spilling out of the back of the van. Sullivan wasn't so lucky. The old man was slumped over the table, blood pooling rapidly across the formica, dripping steadily onto the floor, inches from Arwen's face. Her ears rang with a high, piercing whine. Dust coated her tongue. Panic, cold and absolute, paralyzed her limbs. She was back in the apartment, watching her mother pack her bags, completely helpless as the violence of the world crashed over her. "You don't rely on me. You rely on this." Victor's words broke through the static in her head. She saw a pair of heavy work boots crunching over the broken glass flanking their booth. The shooter was moving to Victor's blind spot, raising a sawed-off shotgun. Victor was pinned down, reloading, focused on the front entrance. He didn't see the man on the right. She didn't think. Thought required time, and time was entirely gone. She shoved her hand into her purse. Her fingers scrambled over keys and chapstick until they found the cold, knurled grip of the Glock. She pulled it out. Her thumb clicked the safety off. She pushed herself up onto her knees, resting her forearms on the shredded vinyl seat of the booth to steady her violently shaking hands. The man with the shotgun turned his head. He saw her. His eyes widened slightly beneath his black ski mask. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands, a sharp, violent explosion that deafened her. The bullet hit him in the collarbone, tearing through the heavy canvas of his jacket. The sheer kinetic force spun him backward. He dropped the shotgun, screaming, crashing into a rotating pie display case. The sound of her gunshot made Victor snap his head around. He saw the man bleeding out on the floor. He saw Arwen kneeling on the booth, the gun still pointed forward, a wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. For a fraction of a second, the firefight stopped. Victor looked at her, his grey eyes wide with a horrified, desperate realization. He had wanted her to know how to protect herself, but he never wanted her to have to do it. He turned back, moving with a sudden feral violence. He stepped out of cover, firing twice into the van, neutralizing the remaining threat. Silence slammed back into the diner, heavier and more terrifying than the gunfire. The only sounds were the hiss of the van's radiator, the whimpering of the waitress behind the counter, and the wet, ragged breathing of the man she had just shot. She looked at the gun in her hands. It felt burning hot. She dropped it on the floor. She scrambled backward, away from the booth, away from Sullivan's blood, until her back hit the wall. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her hands. The smell of copper and burnt hair was suffocating. She leaned over and violently threw up onto the linoleum. Footsteps crunched through the glass. Victor dropped to his knees in front of her. He didn't care about the blood or the mess. He grabbed her shoulders, pulling her roughly into his chest. His hands were covered in plaster dust, his breathing ragged and uneven. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. He was shaking. The monster who broke monsters was trembling. "I've got you," he whispered fiercely, his voice cracking. "I've got you, Arwen. Don't look. Close your eyes." She buried her face in his chest, gripping the front of his shirt with bloody, trembling fingers, and let the darkness take her. Silence returned to the house on the hill like a suffocating blanket. It was 3 a.m. The rain had started again, tapping gently against the massive windows, washing the blood and the dust off the armored SUV parked in the driveway. Arwen sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room. She had scrubbed her skin in the shower until it was raw and pink, but she still smelled the diner. She still felt the jarring recoil in her wrists. She still heard the wet sound the bullet made when it hit bone. The door was open. Victor walked in. He had changed into a clean black t-shirt and dark jeans. The bruise on his face was worse, the skin around his eye swollen shut. He carried her cheap imitation leather duffel bag, the same one she had brought from her mother's apartment. He set the bag gently on the floor near the door. Next to it, he placed a thick manila envelope. She stared at the envelope, her heart doing a slow, painful roll in her chest. "The O'Malley problem has been permanently resolved," Victor said. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual commanding resonance. He looked incredibly old in the dim light. "Russo gave up their location. My men finished it 2 hours ago. There is no one looking for your mother. There is no one looking for you." He pointed to the envelope. "There's $50,000 in cash in there. A new driver's license, a new social security card. Clean. Untraceable." He wouldn't look at her. He looked at the window, watching the rain blur the lights of the city far below. "There is a car waiting at the bottom of the hill. The driver will take you wherever you want to go. State lines the airport or hotel. It doesn't matter." She sat perfectly still. The damp ends of her hair dripped cold water onto her collarbone. "You're sending me away," she said. Her voice was a brittle whisper. "I'm letting you go," he corrected quietly. "Because I shot a man." Victor flinched. The tiny involuntary movement spoke volumes. He finally turned to look at her, his grey eyes swimming with a tortured, self-loathing agony. "Because I watched you cross a line tonight that you can never walk back from," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I brought you here to keep you clean, to keep you safe, and instead I dragged you right into the mud with me. You dropped that gun and you looked at me like you finally realized exactly what kind of monster I am." He took a step back toward the hallway, putting distance between them, acting as if his very proximity was toxic. "Take the money, Arwen. Build a life that doesn't smell like cordite and bleach. You paid your mother's debt. We are square." He turned to walk out. "Stop." The word cracked like a whip in the quiet room. Victor froze in the doorway, his broad back tense. She stood up. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to walk. She walked past the bed, past the thick manila envelope sitting on the floor, past the duffel bag full of frayed sweaters and cheap jeans. She stopped right behind him. "My mother sold me because it was easy," she said to his back, her voice gaining strength with every word. "She traded me to save her own skin because, to her, I was just a commodity, an object." She reached out and placed her hand flat against the center of his back, right over the intricate dark ink of the raven tattoo hidden beneath his shirt. She felt the sharp intake of his breath. "You bought me," she continued, stepping closer until her chest brushed against him. "But you never treated me like I was for sale. You cooked for me. You gave me armor. You put yourself between me and a bullet." Victor slowly turned around. His expression was a raw, agonizing war between desperate hope and crushing guilt. "Arwen, you don't understand what this life is. It doesn't get better. It doesn't get cleaner." "I don't care," she told him, looking fiercely into his bruised, exhausted face. "My whole life before you was a cage. The diner, the apartment, the constant suffocating fear of the next eviction, the next violent boyfriend. It was just a different kind of rot." She reached up her fingers, gently tracing the unbruised side of his jaw. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a starving man, finding bread. "I pulled that trigger today because the thought of watching you die was more terrifying than the thought of taking a life." She whispered the brutal honesty of the confession hanging between them. "I am not collateral anymore, Victor, and I am not a hostage. She stepped back, bent down, and picked up the manila envelope. For a second, panic flared in his eyes. He thought she was taking it. He thought she was leaving. Instead, she walked over to the trash can beside the desk and dropped the envelope inside. $50,000 discarded like junk mail. She turned back to him. He was staring at her, the rigid, terrifying mob boss completely dismantled by a girl in wet hair and bare feet. "I'm staying," she said, her voice steady and absolute. Victor stared at her for a long, fractured moment. Then he crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He grabbed the back of her neck, his fingers twisting into her damp hair, and pulled her mouth to his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruised, and frantic. It tasted of rain and adrenaline, of ruined things finding a way to fit together in the dark. She grabbed the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the man who had bought her life only to give it back to her. Blood isn't thicker than water, but out here in the shadows, loyalty is thicker than both. And she wasn't going anywhere. Thank you for listening to the dramatic conclusion of Arwen and Victor's story. If this dark, gritty journey of survival, loyalty, and unexpected romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please don't forget to hit that like button and drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment between them? Share this video with your fellow Mafia romance lovers, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another intense original story on our channel. Your support means the world. Stay safe and see you next time.